on the logistics of swimming in a river. Now, in the last couple of weeks, I a couple of times swam in a river, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes 40 minutes or 50 minutes. I now want to elaborate on what I found out and what seems to somewhat make sense. First of all, if you swim if you swim in a river, then you probably have your keys with you in some shape or form. Now, in my case, I usually have a tile on them, which allows me to track those keys, at least in theory, because in practice I don't think it works that well. Now, I get usually rid of this tile beforehand, which then allows me to put my key into my zipper pocket. So I do have shorts which have a zipper pocket. Now, if you swim in a river and you have to get to the river somehow, then it at least in my case makes sense to run to the river, because I'm not that far, or I live kind of somewhat close to the river. So if I do want to have an evening workout, then the evening workout consists out of about 10 minutes running to the river, then 10 minutes swimming in the river, and then 10 minutes of getting back. So the whole workout is about 30 minutes. Then I additionally have to shower at home, because the river seems to be the water of the water body. I don't know how often I will say the river. Seems to be usually not that clean, such that I can rely on this being not maybe an issue, and this being not transferred into my bed, for example, or onto my clothes. And maybe there are some I don't know what could be on there. Sometimes it is also just actual dirt, like things that are in the water. Now, in terms of the clothes, what I choose usually are clothes that I can wear for running, therefore, and also then for swimming. Now, for swimming, it seems to make sense that you don't have anything that is very valuable, such as your keys, outside of you, because it takes a little bit of time for you to get from the river then back out again. And in this time you might have already lost your keys. You could also hide your keys somewhere, but well, then it is just a little bit riskier. So recently I tried basically taking just this thing off and then putting him in my zipper pockets. Now, of course, there's also the risk that there might be a hole in your shorts and so on and so forth, so you might lose them, and once you lose the keys in the river, it might be very hard to find. Now, in terms of the clothes, I usually wear a cap, I usually wear a tank top, I usually wear shorts, then sneaker socks and barefoot shoes. In the beginning, what I tried when going then swimming is that I would take off the shoes and the socks, and also the tank top, and so I would leave on the shorts. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, the problem with this approach is that the river, at least I go to, has kind of stones. So as you go in there, and often the water is not that clear, so you don't really see what you're stepping on, and this also left me often with kind of cut feet. So I eventually decided to just leave on my shoes, which also means that you have to have a pair of shoes, which you then don't need for another 1 or 2 days, because they need to dry. Now, this also might decrease the lifespan of a shoe like this, because then, well, if they are just wet for 1 or 2 days, or you want to basically warm them up again, so you could use something like a radiator, or you could use something like a hairdryer, but then you might have to increase the temperature of the thing itself. You might have to heat it up until the point where then the rubber, for example, on this Bible Barefoot Primer Slide 3 might degrade faster compared to if you don't do something like this. So I basically already wear the thing that I then swim in. I only, at least as of now, take off my cap, which I usually have for running, because I usually have hair that is too long for otherwise not flying around when running, and I have the tank top, which is fairly small. Then I usually take the cap and the tank top, and just put the tank top into the cap and then hide it somewhere, such that it is not that obvious that I have things lying outside here, and that there is no suspicion of, okay, maybe there is something hiding in there, maybe there's a phone. Also, in terms of the phone, this is also something, especially if we now go into the other variables. Now, the other variables are, first of all, risk. And with risk, there are basically two different things, I would say. The first thing is that a river obviously also runs at a certain speed. Now, as the river runs at a certain speed, now there are two options. Either you can go up and downstream. The second main risk, I would say, is that if you do cold exposure, this might add another layer of risk, because then you also might have the problem that you either might kind of become very cold, or you might have something like a spasm in the middle of the river. Then you might have trouble coming out. So there are probably rivers which you don't want to actually swim in. Now, of course, there are also these very small rivers, and I tried swimming in them, but the problem with this is, or with these sometimes at least, was that they are just so shallow that you basically hit your knees on basically the ground all the time, which is then somewhat it's just not a very good swimming experience. I think at least need somewhat of the water to be this deep to be somewhat able to breaststroke. Now, I also tried once to get my goggles with me for swimming in the river, but then I need to additionally get them out, and I also need to already think about, okay, do I actually want to go in the river? Because otherwise I can have the decision open. If I begin running towards the river and then it's like, oh, but I rather would be running today, then I can just run the additional 10 minutes and not go swimming. But if I, as planned, swim, then I don't have the additional thing that is the goggles that I have to carry with me, which also take time putting them on. And in my case, because I have hair on the top that is kind of also on the side, then you often get the hair kind of into the rubber band of the goggles, which is often then not as pleasant of a feeling. Now, you can, in terms of the logistics, first of all, not in terms of it's kind of logistics still. So there is the option that you are here, then you run towards the river, and then you get into the river, and then you get out again. Now, this is only possible if you swim exactly at the river's downstream speed. If you swim lower, if you have a lower speed compared to the downstream river speed, then you end up somewhere downstream. If you swim faster compared to the river speed, you end up upstream. Now, if you only swim for 10 minutes, the deviation basically in distance might not be that big, or the deviation in location might not be that big. Today, for example, there was kind of a higher speed than I expected, and I was not able to maintain basically the speed, and therefore I ended up maybe 100 or 200 meters downstream. Now, in addition to this being potentially a problem in terms of then having to run back, and then you are not wearing something, so of course you are wearing your shorts, but in my case I'm also wearing my shoes, so this is not that big of a problem because I can just run in my shoes anywhere. But if you are barefoot, this might become a problem. Now, if you then go out, you basically run back the distance, and also now if it is winter, this also might additionally be a problem because you cannot get back immediately into your clothes. So in summer, this is less of a risk. Now, something else to mention, in a river there sometimes are ships. Rivers sometimes are basically water streets, or whatever the proper word for this is, and so you might have to pay attention to these. So what I usually do is I just look back and forth, similar to how you put on the streets. It is just that you remain more in the constant position, because what I usually do is swim upstream. So as I swim upstream, basically the speed I produce works or the power I produce, but it's mostly now the speed in terms of adding basically the different speeds in terms of Newton, in terms of the Newton mechanics. I don't know if this is the proper phrase. So if I swim like this and the river comes like this, then ideally they cancel out and I get out of the exact location again where I actually also got in. Now, of course, there is a variability in terms of the river's speed. There might be some days at which it rained before, and there might be some days which are rather dry, so therefore you might have resulting lower speed. And it also might have rained 200 kilometers before, and therefore there is still a higher water level, for example. Now, combining cold exposure adds an additional risk layer. What I have been doing till now is 50 breaststrokes kind of throughout the year after every run on a Sunday that I did in the last 2 years, at least in this location where I began to live. So I still was able to do this, but once doing cold exposure only like this once a week is, I think, not enough to maintain kind of a level that would be sufficient for basically somewhat feeling okay in the water. It is always kind of a shock, at least if you do it once. Similarly to sauna, where I also seem to not be able to maintain now a high basically a duration in the sauna without getting out. So I was able to once do a 45-minute session at 90 degrees Celsius, but this was also, I optimized kind of the day for it. I tried to fast as long as I could before in order to then be as cool as possible in the sauna. And then I also usually cold shower before, because I always just shower cold and I have to shower before sauna. So this is kind of a constraint there. Back to swimming in the river. Now, what I additionally tried is I went on a run, and then the idea was that I would use the river as a transportation tool to come downstream again. So I would basically run upstream to, in this case, 5 kilometers, and then I would transport myself downstream in the river again. Basically, instead of now working these two speeds working against, I will basically add them up. So I would be twice as fast as the river's speed, because usually I'm about as fast as the river goes downstream. Now this is now kind of an approximation of the speed. If a person walks usually at 5 kilometers per hour, then last Sunday, or no, it was already the Sunday before, I think, I saw a person that actually walked by, and as I swam downstream and also the person walked downstream, this person was about as fast, maybe a little bit slower compared to me. So if we take the 5 kilometers per hour and then say, okay, this is basically double, then I am probably usually swimming at around 2 to 2.5 kilometers per hour, or maybe it's a little bit higher or a little bit lower than this. Compare this to running. This might be 10 kilometers per hour. I actually don't know the speeds. I only know the paces, and in terms of the paces, I run usually maybe a 5k, I don't know, depending on my form. Sometimes it's 6 minutes, sometimes it's 5:30, sometimes I approximate kind of a 5-minute pace, but I'm just not that good of a runner for my paces to be something that would be remarkable, I think. Now, what this meant for me is that I kind of miscalculated the whole thing. So I ran these 7 kilometers upstream, and then I figured I would be downstream in 10 to 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes again. What happened was not this, because I only swam downstream at about half the speed at which I basically ran upstream, which meant that the 40 minutes it took me for the 5 to 7 kilometers basically doubled. And this was kind of not anticipated by me, so I eventually ran into a problem because it had 15 degrees Celsius outside. The duration of exposure to the water body, even with swimming all the time, and I also basically increased the intensity to the maximum intensity I could kind of maintain, in order to kind of counter the effect of the water cooling my body down. And even at this intensity, I was not able to basically then prevent myself from beginning to shiver, and I also experienced some cramping, or kind of the precursor to cramping in my legs, which also then kind of the combination of those factors then led me to just go outside and to just at about, I don't know, half or 2/3 of the distance, maybe more half of the distance of basically the 5 to 7 kilometers I ran previously upstream, I got out and ran the rest backwards. Now, I was in a very alert and a very alert state due to basically the cold exposure, but I was not that fast because it was now almost 1.5 hours, maybe 2 hours into the activity. So the whole activity just took lots of time, and I usually try to not have these very big activity slots, because these are just, in terms of being able to repeat everything in a given day, they are just not very useful. So in summary, one could say one has to first of all figure out the logistics of what one is trying to do, then see the swimming speed and the current, so the swimming speed and the downstream speed, and one has to figure out, okay, one has to figure out the close, one has to figure out where one wants to enter and where one could end up after a certain duration. Then there is also the possibility to use the river as a kind of a travel thing, but in my case I did it in the early morning, so on a Sunday also, so there were no ships, or basically there was one peddler who went by, and he said like, oh, over there you could get potentially out, and I grinned. And the claws are something, the keys are something, then the upstream and downstream thing, and where you want to end up. And then you also have the two risks, maybe the cramping and also the river speed, potentially not getting out, because I mean people probably already have drunken in rivers, I assume at least, and kind of underestimated how much effort it would take to get to the other end of the river. In my case, it is maybe a 40 meter broad river or something like this. And then you also have to keep in mind the cold exposure, and this changes somewhat obviously over the years. Now, the duration is one factor, and also the temperature of the water is a factor. In my case, or in my experience, what also seems to be a big factor is whether I am kind of more in a fasted state, and this also, as duration of workout increases, and or if I am more in a fat state, then I seem to have more temperature or heat energy available.